My phone suddenly received a call that I couldn't hang up. The male voice on the other end belonged to my husband. The female voice belonged to his mistress. A muffled conversation kept playing. They were detailing a perfect murder plot against someone. Every step was chillingly precise. I tried to call 911, but every number I dialed was automatically routed back to this ongoing call. After a grueling process of deduction, I finally pinpointed the location they were describing. It was my own house. And right now a sudden, urgent knock echoed from my bedroom door. This was step 1 of their murder plan. The knocking on the door was extremely rhythmic. 3 long, 1 short. It was a unique habit of my husband, Julian. The unhang-up-able call on my phone was still playing. On the line, Julian's voice was cold to the core. The sleeping pills are already in her warm milk. Once she drinks it, we can set up the suicide scene. Outside the door, Julian's voice came through, soft and gentle. Clara, honey, I made you some warm milk. Open the door. I stood behind the door, keeping silent. If I didn't open it, he would definitely use his key. I turned around, rushed to the dining table, and slipped a vitamin tablet between my fingers. Then I opened the door. Julian walked in, holding a steaming glass of milk. His mother, Martha, followed closely behind. Her eyes darted around shiftily. Julian handed me the glass with a warm smile. Babe, you've been working too hard lately. Drink this while it's hot and get some good sleep. I looked down at the pure white liquid. It's too hot, I said, taking the glass. Let me get a napkin first. I turned my back to them, blocking their view. I tilted my wrist. The entire glass of milk poured right into the soil of the lush monstera plant next to the TV stand. In the same motion, I popped the vitamin tablet into my mouth, crushed it, and swallowed. I turned back and placed the empty glass, still stained with a ring of milk, on the table. Julian walked over and glanced at the empty glass. He exchanged a look with his mother. Then he looked at me. Why don't you lie down on the couch for a bit? I nodded, pretending my limbs were heavy, and shuffled to the couch. I collapsed onto the cushions and closed my eyes. My breathing slowed down, becoming deep and even. The living room fell dead silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. A moment later, I heard Julian let out a long sigh of relief. Immediately after, the bedroom door was pushed open from the inside. Light footsteps approached. Is she completely out? A young woman's voice whispered. It was Vivian, the nurse from Julian's private clinic. So, she had been hiding in our house this whole time. Martha immediately complained in a hushed, harsh whisper. Why did the drug take so long to kick in? Hurry up and do it. I checked the ceiling beam on the balcony this afternoon. It can easily hold an adult's weight. The footsteps stopped right beside me. Vivian leaned over. Her perfume, mixed with the faint scent of chemical disinfectant, invaded my nose. The rough texture of a hemp rope brushed against the skin of my neck. She began measuring the rope around my neck to tie the noose. Don't leave any struggle marks. It has to look natural, Julian whispered. I know. Vivian's voice held a trace of sick excitement. Once she's dead, we're finally free. Martha urged from the side. Hurry up. Don't waste time. I'm going to file the paperwork for this house and her bank accounts first thing tomorrow. Once Vivian gives birth to my grandbaby, our family can finally live in peace. They were practicing a murder right in front of me, on my own body. Julian walked back to the table. The sound of paper rustling echoed. He placed a piece of paper on the table. The suicide note is ready. Now let's hang her up. Vivian's hands tightened around my neck, pulling the loop closed. I'll lift her up, you kick the chair, Julian said, stepping closer. The exact second Vivian exerted force to tighten the rope, I snapped my eyes wide open. The living room instantly fell into a graveyard silence. Vivian shrieked, her hands trembling as she lost her balance and fell flat on her butt. Julian's outstretched hands froze in midair. Martha gasped loudly, slapping her hand over her mouth. The three of them froze like statues, their eyes bulging out, staring at me in sheer terror. I sat up, ripped the rope off my neck, and tossed it to the floor. Ignoring their horrified stares, I reached over and grabbed the suicide note from the table. My eyes swept over the words. I looked at Julian and spoke coldly. Very touching. I slapped the paper back onto the table. But if you want to fake my suicide by hanging, don't you think you need to edit this note first? Julian's face turned from pale to livid. He looked at the rope on the floor, then at my completely sober eyes, finally realizing what was happening. He gritted his teeth, his expression turning dark as he stepped toward me. You didn't drink the milk. Well, since you didn't take the drug, you can die awake. He shot a look at Vivian. Vivian scrambled up from the floor, grabbed the rope, and lunged at me. I let out a cold laugh. Dr. Julian, don't you even know the basic legal regulations when you try to commit a murder? I pointed at the suicide note. Your note says I hung myself due to severe, untreated clinical depression. But as the president of the HOA, I just led a community blood drive last Friday. My blood sample is registered in the national database, and it's completely clean. A patient with severe depression, who has zero traces of antidepressants in her system for months? The moment the medical examiner runs a toxicology report on my blood and hair, your depression story is going to blow up in your face. Julian's footsteps abruptly stopped. Vivian panicked. She stood frozen with the rope, looking back at Julian. Martha's face flushed red with rage. She lunged forward, claws out, trying to strangle me herself. Who cares about that? Just kill her first. I quickly stepped back, grabbed the heavy glass ashtray from the table, and slammed it onto the tile floor. With a loud crash, glass shattered everywhere. Martha shrieked and pulled her hands back. I glared at them. And how do you plan to handle my body? Take it straight to the crematorium? Keep dreaming. In this district, any death that doesn't happen under a doctor's care in a hospital is classified as an unattended death. The crematorium won't touch a body without a coroner's release form and a police report. You run a tiny, private neighborhood clinic. What authority do you have to sign a death certificate for an unattended death? The moment you try to move my body out of this building, the police will open a homicide investigation. Silence enveloped the room. Vivian's hands began to shake violently, and the rope slipped to the floor. Martha looked at Julian, terrified. Julian, is she telling the truth? I stared at Julian coldly. I thought these basic legal facts would be enough to terrify them. After all, they wanted a perfect suicide, not a messy homicide that would make them wanted fugitives. But right then, something incredibly bizarre happened. Julian actually smiled. He wasn't scared at all. Instead, he casually walked over to the couch and sat down. Vivian stopped shaking too. She stepped forward, grabbed the suicide note from the table, and tore it to shreds, piece by piece, right in front of me. She tossed the shredded paper into the trash can. Martha sighed, her face twisting into an expression of fake, mocking sympathy. I told you, Martha said sneeringly. Her mental illness is getting worse. She's completely delusional. Ranting about murder, she doesn't even recognize her own family anymore. My brows furrowed as I watched their sudden change in behavior. Julian pulled his phone out of his pocket. He looked at me, his voice as cold as ice. Clara, your paranoid schizophrenia is flaring up again. What murder? That suicide note was just some garbage paper you scribbled during your episode. Vivian tore it up so it wouldn't trigger you. And that rope? It's just a cable for repairing the balcony. He tapped his phone screen. Your mental state is extremely unstable right now, and you're exhibiting violent behavior. As your husband, I have no choice but to call the psychiatric hospital to pick you up. My blood ran cold. I could not let them take me to a psychiatric hospital. Once I was locked in there, any accident would easily be written off as a real suicide. I immediately reached into my pocket for my phone to call 911. The screen lit up, but in the top left corner, the signal bars showed a red no service. Julian pointed smugly to the corner behind the door. Don't waste your breath. Before I came in, I turned on a medical-grade signal jammer. You can't send a single text. I didn't panic. Instead, I pointed to a small, inconspicuous white box mounted on the baseboard. You forgot what I do for a living. That is a life alert emergency button for the elderly in our community. It runs on a dedicated, low-frequency cellular band. Your cheap jammer can't block it. When I had stepped back to smash the ashtray earlier, my heel had already pressed that button. The moment the words left my mouth, heavy pounding erupted on the front door. Clara, open up. It's Lily. The door wasn't locked. Lily, my HOA assistant, burst in. Right behind her were two police officers from the local precinct. It was like finding a lifeline in a stormy sea. I screamed immediately. Officers! They are trying to kill me. The milk in that pot is poisoned. And they have a rope to hang me. The officers instantly went on high alert, stepping between us. Nobody move. What's going on here? The lead officer demanded. I pointed at the Monstera plant. Test the soil. The milk poured in there is full of sleeping pills. The officer glanced at Julian and nodded to the accompanying forensic tech to take a sample of the wet soil. 5 minutes later, the tech looked at the screen of his rapid testing device. He looked up at the officer and shook his head. It's just regular calcium powder drink. No traces of sedatives or toxins. I felt like I had fallen into an abyss. That's impossible. I pointed frantically at the rope on the floor. What about the rope? They tried to put it around my neck. Lily looked at me, her face filled with awkward concern. Clara, Julian bought that cable today to secure your balcony railing. I literally registered his maintenance request this afternoon. Lily avoided my eyes, asking softly, Clara, did you forget to take your medication again? I froze. What medication? Lily pulled a thick folder from her bag and handed it to the police. Officers, these are Clara's medical records. Inside were medical reports from various psychiatric clinics over the past 6 months. There was even a video of me losing my temper and slamming a table during an HOA meeting. I stared at Julian in horror. Over the past 6 months, he had used his medical knowledge to slip microdoses of hallucinogenic drugs into my food. It kept me in a constant state of irritability and paranoia. He had spent months painting a picture for the entire neighborhood. Clara is a poor, unstable woman. The officer's guarded looks turned into sympathy. The lead officer handed the files back to Lily and sighed. I desperately pulled out my phone. I am not crazy. There is a call on my phone that won't hang up. It recorded them planning to kill me tonight. Listen. I tapped the audio to play it out loud. But what came out of the speaker was not a murder conspiracy. It was the dialogue of a mystery audiobook I had downloaded 3 months ago. Julian must have used our shared cloud drive while I was in the shower to force lock this audio on a loop in my phone's background. All my evidence, in this very second, was rendered completely useless in a perfectly legal, undeniable way. The lead officer sighed. He stepped forward and spoke to me in a very gentle, soothing tone. Clara, please calm down. Take a deep breath. Then he turned to Julian. Dr. Julian, your wife's condition is very unstable. It's not safe for her to stay home. You should contact a specialized facility immediately. If needed, we can assist you with an involuntary hold so she doesn't hurt herself. Julian's eyes turned red. He put on a perfect performance of an exhausted, devoted husband. He walked over, wrapping an arm around my shoulder, his voice cracking with emotion. Thank you, officer. I've already contacted the private care facility. The ambulance should be here any minute. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. Sweetie, we'll get you some help. I don't blame you. I struggled wildly. Get off me. I am not sick. Vivian immediately stepped forward in her nurse's uniform. She held a pre-filled syringe in her hand. Clara, please hold still. Your heart rate is too high. You might go into shock. I'm going to give you a mild sedative to help you rest. The police stood right there, watching. To them, this was professional medical staff treating a manic patient. They had no reason to stop her. The cold needle brushed against my vein. Once this drug entered my system, I would lose all ability to fight back, and I would be dragged into a hell I could never escape. Every path was blocked. I looked into Julian's mocking eyes. He had won. He had dismantled all my logic and common sense. Every second felt like an eternity. Just as the needle was about to pierce my skin, my eyes fell on Julian's shoes. They were the leather shoes he usually wore at his clinic. In the crevices of the soles, there was a tiny trace of dark red powder. That wasn't regular dirt. Suddenly, everything clicked in my mind. So that's what this is. The cold steel of the needle's bevel rested against the skin of my forearm, pushing a small, shallow dent into my vein. Clara, honey, just close your eyes, Julian whispered, his hand on my shoulder, keeping me pinned against the leather of the couch. His fingers were warm, but his grip was tight, calculated to look like a comforting embrace to the two police officers standing by the doorway. It's just a mild sedative. It'll make the voices stop. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum against the glass of the balcony door. I didn't scream. I didn't struggle. My eyes were fixed on the lower edge of Julian's right shoe, the expensive, Italian calfskin loafers he had bought last month with our joint household account. In the narrow recessed grooves of the rubber heel, there was a thin, caked line of dark red crystalline powder. It wasn't regular dirt. It wasn't the gray clay of our neighborhood's garden beds. It possessed a faint, metallic luster under the bright LED light of the living room, and where it had come into contact with the wet leather, it had turned a distinct, bruised shade of deep purple, red phosphorus. And right next to it, clinging to the stitching of the sole, were tiny, white, needle-like crystals of pseudoephedrine. Officers, wait, I said. My voice was not hysterical. It was low, flat, and carried a sharp, dry authority that made the lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, pause. Had been reaching into his pocket for the involuntary hold paperwork, but he stopped, his gray eyes narrowing as he looked at me. Clara, please, Vivian said, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to align the syringe. The longer you delay, the worse your anxiety will. I am a senior analyst for the State Environmental Protection Agency, Sergeant Miller, I said, looking straight into the officer's eyes. My credential card is in the front pocket of my leather purse on the counter. You can call the state directory right now to verify my license. Julian's hand on my shoulder stiffened. Sergeant, don't listen to her, Julian said quickly, a sudden sharp edge of panic vibrating in his voice. She's integrating her delusions into her professional life. It's a common symptom of red phosphorus, I interrupted, pointing my left index finger directly at the heel of Julian's right shoe. It is a Class I regulated precursor chemical under the State Controlled Substances Act. It is used primarily in the illegal synthesis of methamphetamine and synthetic psychotropics. The room went entirely silent. The forensic tech, who had been packing his rapid testing kit back into his silver case stopped. He turned around, his eyes instantly dropping to Julian's. Shoes. What are you talking about? Martha stammered from the kitchen doorway, her hands clutching her cardigan. He's a doctor. He runs a respectable neighborhood clinic. He runs an unlicensed compounding lab in the basement of his clinic, I said, my voice remaining perfectly level. The red phosphorus on his heel is reacting with the acid in the wet leather, leaving that purple margin. And the white needles on his sole are pseudoephedrine. If your tech runs a chemical swab on his shoes or the floor mats of his Mercedes parked downstairs, you'll find traces of high-purity methamphetamine precursors within 3 minutes. Sergeant Miller looked at the forensic tech. Dave, check the shoes. This is a violation of my civil rights. Julian roared, standing up from the couch, his face turning an ugly mottled purple. You have no warrant. I am a licensed medical professional. Mr. Graham, Miller said, his hand dropping from his holster to the heavy steel handcuffs at his waist. Under the state's emergency public safety statute, any credible report of a Class I chemical hazard or illegal laboratory allows for an immediate, non-warrant forensic sweep of the suspect's person and vehicle. Dave, get the swabs. Vivian's hand shook so violently that the syringe slipped from her fingers, landing on the tile floor with a sharp, hollow clink. The clear liquid inside, not a sedative, but a high-concentration dose of succinylcholine, pooled slowly near her shoe. The basement garage of the Riversedge Apartments was cold, smelling of damp concrete, old tires, and exhaust fumes. Julian stood against the brick pillar, his arms pinned behind his back by the second officer, his face pale and sweating under the harsh yellow halogen lights. Beside him, Martha was weeping quietly, her hands covering her face, while Vivian stared at the concrete floor in absolute silence. The trunk of Julian's silver Mercedes was open. Dave, the forensic tech, was kneeling inside, his blue latex gloves covered in a thin layer of gray dust as he used a portable UV scanner to sweep the carpet lining. We've got a hit, Sarge, Dave called out, his voice echoing in the empty garage. The scanner is picking up high-intensity fluorescence on the left panel. It's a match for chemical residue. He reached deeper into the spare tire well, pulling out a large, heavy-duty black trash bag that had been sealed with industrial duct tape. He used a pair of scissors to cut the plastic open. Inside were 4 large, amber glass bottles with handwritten labels: anhydrous, ammonia, hydrochloric acid, and red phosphorus, 99.8% technical grade. Beside them lay a small, professional digital scale and 3 boxes of prescription-strength hallucinogen vials, the exact same drug Julian had been slipping into my food for the past 6 months to fake my schizophrenia medical records. Dr. Julian, Sergeant Miller said, his voice dropping into a cold, dry register. As he walked over to him, you've got a lot of interesting equipment for a neighborhood general practitioner. It's for my research, Julian stammered, his chin trembling, his eyes darting toward the exit of the garage. I'm working on a paper about synthetic anesthetics. I have the corporate authorizations. The corporate authorizations don't allow you to store 10 gallons of toxic precursors in a residential parking garage, Mr. Graham, Miller said. He pulled the heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and clicked them around Julian's wrists with a sharp, final clank. Then he turned to Vivian and Miss Shaw, as the registered nurse who signed the inventory logs for these pharmaceuticals at the clinic. You're coming with us too. Vivian didn't look at him. She slowly reached out her hands, letting the second officer lock her wrists without a single word of protest. Martha collapsed against the hood of the car, her voice rising in a desperate, cracked wail. Julian, my baby. He didn't do anything. It was the girl. She set him up. She's the crazy one. Mrs. Graham, Miller said, his voice cold. I suggest you hire a very good lawyer, because once the state attorney's office looks at the financial logs of your son's clinic, they're going to be looking at you next. I stood near the concrete stairs, my hands slipped into the pockets of my trench coat, watching them get ushered into the back of the police cruisers. The sirens didn't wail. They simply flickered, red and blue lights washing over the gray concrete walls of the garage, turning their faces into a bruised, shifting shadow as the cars drove away into the rainy night. The private clinic of Dr. Julian Graham was located in a quiet, brick-fronted building on the corner of Central Avenue. By Thursday morning, the building was surrounded by yellow police tape. I sat in the small, warm office of my attorney, Sarah Lynn, looking at the financial spreadsheets she had spent the last 24 hours compiling from the clinic's seized databases. It's a masterpiece of a fraud, Clara, Sarah said, sliding a thick ledger across the desk. Julian wasn't just compounding drugs. He was running a systematic estate theft ring targeting his elderly patients. She tapped a page in the ledger. 4 years ago, an elderly widow named Clara Vance Yes, she had the same first name as you, which is probably why he targeted you. Died of natural causes. Under his care. Her entire estate, worth approximately $1.2 million, was transferred to a private trust managed by Martha Graham. And the death certificate? I asked, my throat tightening. Julian signed it himself, Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a cold, professional anger. He listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest due to senile dementia. But the clinic's hidden basement laboratory, the one the police found behind the sterilization unit yesterday, had 3 jars of aconitine. It's an organic poison that mimics a heart attack and leaves no traces in a standard autopsy unless you're specifically looking for it. She reached into her folder and pulled out a second document. We filed a formal petition with the state court to freeze all of Julian and Martha's assets, including the Riversedge apartment and the bank accounts, because he used faked medical files to try and commit you to a psychiatric facility to hide his crimes. The court has granted a temporary receivership over his entire estate. I looked out the window at the gray, rain-slicked street. I didn't feel a sudden, dramatic burst of happiness. I didn't feel like a hero. I simply felt a deep, quiet relief that the signal jammer was gone. The white ashtray on my living room floor was cleaned up, and the cold needle of Vivian's syringe was locked in a police evidence box where it could never touch me. Thank you, Sarah, I said softly. 1 year later. The spring in the city was late, but when it came, it was beautiful. The cherry blossoms along the river park were beginning to bloom, their pale pink petals falling slowly onto the wet grass under the warm afternoon sun. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, a cup of hot black tea in my hands. The apartment was smaller than the one at Riversedge, but it was bright with wide glass doors that let in the sun, and there was no white monstera plant near the TV stand. My phone on the table buzzed. It was a message from Sarah Lynn. Clara, the final court ruling has been signed. Julian Graham has been sentenced to 20 years for corporate fraud, drug manufacturing, and the attempted murder of a spouse. Martha Graham received 8 years as an accomplice, and Vivian Shaw's nurse's license has been permanently revoked under her 10-year sentence. I locked the phone and slid it into my pocket. I didn't think about the 3 long, 1 short knocks on the door anymore. I didn't think about the warm milk or the tattered pieces of the suicide note. I looked out at the river, where the white gulls were soaring through the clean blue sky, their wings catching the morning light as they flew toward the horizon. The dark, suffocating room where I had lived for 6 years was finally behind me. The walls knocked down, the doors opened. I was safe. I was clean. And the road ahead of me was wide, bright, and completely my own.